you disconnected me.
That's all right. We are live. I've got Simon standing by, and thanks everyone for joining yet again. Thank you for your contribution, your sharing, your comments, your likes, etc. Follows. Had a whole lot of people follow over the weekend on World Series News, more than 1,000 in fact. So that's massive. I've got Simon in the background. He's been working all weekend. He's in Florida on a massive amount of news, and I'm really, really looking forward to bringing it to you in just a moment. It will be a long edition today. There's a lot to get through, and what it will do is confirm all that we have seen over the last few weeks. In fact, it's all coming together. This show is called The Counter Narrative. This is the news that you don't get in the West, and you will see how important that is because of the lack of reporting. You'll realise that there really is a lot going on. We talk about things like the de-dollarization, countries around the world no longer using the US dollar, what all that means. Of course, you've got the US debt ceiling coming up, a lot of panic in the US. We're not even going to have to go into that information today. What we are going to talk about is nuclear deals, railway deals, the power of China, the use of Russian minerals and commodities, Russian oil, and how it is that countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, the rest of the Middle East are putting together massive deals and are building an alternative to what we might call the World Economic Forum's New World Order. If you like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and it certainly means that there is an opposition once and for all to the West dominating. Let's try and bring Simon in right now, and we should get on with the show. Simon, you there?
Yes, I am, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. It certainly has been just an incredible amount of news the last 48 hours.
Yeah, it certainly has. And look, I just want to say thank you very much also for continuing to be there to support us here in Australia and putting together a massive amount of work. We are experimenting here on the World Series News channel with a format to best suit our audience, and we're going for a long edition. We're doing shorter 5-minute single story updates for those that are looking for specific news. But when you get into the 1-hour shows, and what I like to say to people is treat it maybe perhaps like a radio show, have it on in the background. Of course, you can play it if you can on your YouTube, where we're playing out to now. We're also playing out on Twitter, Jason Q Citizen 1, or also Simon from Florrie 2. That's Simon's Twitter feed, and of course here on Facebook, where a lot of the action is going. But the point is that there are different ways. You can watch it on your telly, listen to it in the car, whatever, but you're going to pick up on the details that you're not getting in the West. And what it will show you is that the US is not in control of the world. The World Economic Forum is not in control of the world like we thought, but there is a lot of toing and froing. And today, Simon, we're going to talk a really interesting part. We have talked a lot about BRICS in the past, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa group, and then of course you've got Saudi Arabia, Iran. But we're going to notice a bit what India is up to, and India seems to be sort of crossing the bridge to both sides here, and what that means in terms of the railways. And therefore, if Israel is playing a part in all of this, how is it that Israel wants a little bit of a taste of the action, so to speak, and we'll get into the details of the Arab League and Syria's reintroduction and what all that means. I know it sounds complicated, but when you put it all together, you start to draw out these great facts and you understand the power of what is actually going on here. So perhaps a really good way to start today, Simon, is an interesting headline. China has been humiliated and immediately gets their revenge. Can you fill us in? Because this is sort of culminates in the coronation over the weekend.
So this is quite an interesting sideshow to the coronation of King Charles III that happened on Saturday, London time. So obviously people were aware that there were foreign dignitaries from all over the world who went to attend the service. Mm-hmm. And many of them had flown in the previous days and had the opportunity to have meetings both with members of the British government, but also bilateral meetings with other people who just happened to be in the same place at the same time. Now, at the invitation of Mr. Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom government, the Vice President of China was invited to a meeting at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. Nothing particularly unusual about that per se. However, Mr. Cleverly, who likes very much posting selfies, then posted a picture of himself with the Chinese vice president sat round a rectangular table, and detailed how he had chewed him out. Mr. Cleverly had chewed out the Chinese government very senior representative concerning human rights in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang. Now, bearing in mind that the vice president was significantly senior to him, and he was only in London in order to go to the coronation of the king. That was an extraordinarily undiplomatic thing, not only to do in private, but to do in public and just humiliate that Chinese gentleman and his entourage, who were all included in the photograph. So the next day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China published their letter of congratulations to King Charles. Now, I actually was so stunned by this that while I was out just doing some regular chores yesterday, I actually just decided just some regular everyday people that I come across during my day, I'm going to read out this paragraph to them and just get a man on the street type reaction. And I must admit, this is the first time I've done this. Okay.
Yep.
But as people will understand when I read the sentence, these people were some garage mechanics, a charity shop manager, and a fishmonger. So they were real average Joes. Okay. And they were absolutely stunned and collectively said, that reads like you would expect to see in a diplomatic ultimatum threatening a declaration of war. And this was supposed to be a congratulation letter. So now that everyone's set up for that, put your ears back and your listening helmet on and just listen to this one sentence.
Let's have it.
So, President Xi Jinping notes that the world today is undergoing profound and complex changes, and the international community is faced with many unprecedented challenges. That's the first sentence of the letter of congratulations to King Charles as presented on the Chinese Ministry of Affairs website.
Amazing.
That's not have a nice day.
That is certainly not, is it? And it's telling them that there is an opposition to what's going on right now. That is a massive statement. Was there anything more there that that came out in that big statement?
So they talk about. I can. It's not long. I can go into some of the rest of it if you like. They go on further to say, and this is really like a political démarche. It's not congratulations at all.
Yeah.
It says China and the UK, both permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, should take a long-term and strategic view to jointly promote the historical trend of peace, development, and win-win cooperation. Now, win-win cooperation is about global trade. So that's a comment that's contrary to what Cleverly has been talking about, where he's been talking about avoiding the American-style decoupling, but doing the European-style de-risking so that they're not entirely dependent upon China, say, for example, for their antibiotic supplies.
Yes.
Okay? So it then says, China is ready to work with the UK to enhance friendship between the two peoples, which once again is contrary to the British sending a nuclear-armed submarine to patrol the South China Sea. That's what's being proposed by the same gentleman, Mr. Cleverly, at the Mansion House speech, right?
Yep.
And China wants them to expand mutually beneficial cooperation, deepen cultural and people-to-people exchanges so as to bring more benefits to the two countries and the world at large with a stable and mutually beneficial China-UK relationship. Okay, I mean, normally most of these letters of congratulations have said something like, may you live long in order to reign over the peoples of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, and we, wish you good health and all success in your environmental endeavors, or something like that.
Yes.
Right? Not back the heck off or we'll nuke you. So it was extraordinary, and the response was very interesting.
Go on.
So the Chinese published a photograph of the vice president personally talking and shaking hands with King Charles on Sunday, UK time. But that photograph appears to have been taken 1 or 2 days earlier, okay, at a reception at Buckingham Palace, where lots of ambassadors and presidents and stuff were invited. But it was interesting that was published later, okay? Then they also published a series of photographs of the vice president meeting not only with the British Prime Minister, but also with the British Deputy Prime Minister. And they made the point that they had the meeting with the new British Deputy Prime Minister, who was the equivalent rank to the Chinese vice president, okay, only because he had specifically asked for the meeting. So clearly what happened is Cleverley's fingers got slammed shut in the piano. The Chinese put out their incredibly staunch reaction, and then the vice president was invited to number 10 Downing Street. He had a social meeting with the prime minister and a formal meeting with the deputy prime minister, and they grovelled.
What was was there a statement that came out from 10 Downing?
No.
So what do we know about that meeting?
Just what the Chinese have published in terms of the photographs. And that in itself is interesting.
Yes.
Because there wasn't a joint statement from the British Prime Minister saying, oops, I grovelled, which you wouldn't expect them, frankly, to do.
Of course not, yeah.
Right.
But it is interesting, isn't it, when we're talking about just a visit from a representative to the coronation, and this has all come about that. Simon, I want to put a photograph up on the screen. We haven't prepared it, but it's interesting in terms of the US presence at the coronation. Take a look at this photograph. There's Jill Biden up the back with her, look at that, she's wearing a blue dress and seated next to, is it a daughter-in-law with the yellow dress?
I must admit, I'm not absolutely certain of the identity of that woman, but it was her companion, because Biden was sent a, President plus one. He declined to go, said that his wife would represent him, which was odd, as opposed to the vice president, which most other countries were sending if the head of state wasn't going. She then chose as her plus one to take the lady sitting next to her, and they very publicly entered in blue and yellow dresses, which obviously are the colours of Ukraine. In response, they were seated at the absolute back row of the hall, so that the cameras really couldn't focus in on them. So even though the UK is incredibly pro-Ukraine and Zelensky, as we've seen in previous shows and have been widely reported, they just didn't feel that it was appropriate on the day, because it was kind of like a state event as opposed to a political event. And a lot of American commentators noticed their seating relegation.
I find that absolutely fascinating because, of course, we saw when Trump was president, he was front and centre everywhere. It just seems odd that Biden's, first of all, turning up with a political statement at a coronation, and then you've got the UK who have delivered a political statement to the Chinese and had to sort of grovel over all of that. So there's a real imbalance in what's going on. Simon, I want to continue the show now, and I want to move to a very big topic, and it's nuclear energy and some massive revelations we hear once again from China. Now, for people that aren't aware, even in the Middle East, the oil capital of the planet, there is a move towards a new green energy agenda, and it involves nuclear power. Now, the centre of all of this, of course, is China, but it's the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, that have had a remarkable development. Tell us more.
So this is very important for people to understand when they're looking at smart cities and the green agenda and the WEF and all the COP conferences, the COP conferences. Now, United Arab Emirates is the host for the 28th COP conference at the end of November. And they, even though they are dependent in large part upon their huge wealth from the export of oil, have declared their intention to embrace the green agenda and to try and decarbonize their economy. Okay. And to that end, they are building a very large set of nuclear reactors, all in one plant, but with 6 actual reactors.
Huge.
And when complete, that will provide 25% of their current peak electricity demand. And then a lot of it's going to come from wind offshore and solar power, obviously, because they're like in the desert. So it's a great spot for solar power. Okay. Now, they are cooperating with the Chinese in building that. But the Chinese not only went to meet with the UAE this weekend, but they also met with a representative, the deputy of Mr. Dr. Maruki, who we have previously talked about, his deputy negotiator for the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the 6 countries around the Persian Gulf, excluding Iraq and Iran. They all appear to be talking with the Chinese about the prospect of getting nuclear power. Okay. Now, the next question would be, where would the fuel come from? And just as Europe have had a huge struggle to disassociate themselves from the Russian Federation, where they were heavily dependent upon their gas and oil being piped via Poland and Ukraine, one would think that the Middle East, who previously have just burnt oil in order to generate electricity, which obviously is quite polluting, as part of their transition, they look like they're going to be heavily dependent upon Iran, who this year have announced discovery after discovery after discovery of uranium deposits. So that just goes to show the advanced integration of Iran and the other Persian Gulf states in order that they would have trust for that level of dependence. This is clearly not what the Americans have been trying to portray, a temporary de-escalation of tensions between these countries.
Yep.
You don't spend billions of dollars doing deals with the Chinese to build nuclear power plants that are going to be dependent on fuel from Iran if you think that you might be at war any second with the uranium supply that you need for your nuclear power plants. Now, there's a few other sources that they could get them from, but they're all thousands and thousands of miles away. Okay, so we see that being particularly important, and at the same time, you've got the UAE meeting, as we discussed on Friday, with the Saudis and the Americans and the Indians in Riyadh today. Now, when we initially discussed this, it appeared that the main issue that the Americans were dashing there were two things: Saudi-Israel diplomatic relation normalizations, and in particular, trying to block the return of Syria to the Arab League.
Yes.
Now, what's been very interesting is that three individual news sources have put out specific information about these meetings. So one very remote, minor news source is called the VCA London News. They have a very small Twitter following. But what struck me as extraordinary is that 7 separate Saudi Arabian government ministers were following that news source. Now, on Friday, after I had spoken with you, they published a story saying that secretly, during the week, both the energy coordinator and the national security coordinator of the American National Security Council, which is headed by the man who's meeting the Saudi crown prince in Riyadh on Sunday, today, had flown to the United Arab Emirates for like a pre-meeting.
Yep.
Now, it was then reported in Axios news magazine that Mr. Sullivan, in the conference presentation that you and I had previously discussed at the Near East Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., in addition to talking about America's relationship with Israel and this concept of granting them freedom of action regarding Iran, right? Despite that extraordinarily important statement, he had actually told the audience that if they took away anything from his presentation, what they should remember was this acronym I2U2. Okay, I'll explain what that is. But this has to be seen in the context that he thought this, what I'm about to explain to you, was more important than Israel potentially attacking Iran. Okay, so that makes this pretty important.
Yes.
All right. So this I2U2 stands for India, Israel, United States of America, and United Arab Emirates. It's the first letter of their name.
Yes.
I2U2. Okay. Now that's only existed for a couple of years, and it's all part of what I discussed with you on Friday, which is this whole, they're now not using the name Middle East, they're now using the term West Asia. Okay. And this is all about West Asian connectivity, which was the other catchword that I mentioned to you. Okay. Now, in and of itself, that didn't particularly explain the scheme that was underfoot. It just looked like classic Israeli, want more countries to recognize us and want to block cooperation among other Arab nations that could be against our interests. Okay? And we've been used to seeing that the last 75 years. But in the Times of Israel today, they published an article. And once again, these things I will link to the news story so people can read them in detail should they wish to, as I've been trying to do after the shows.
Yep.
But they gave a very, very interesting account. Now, the audience will remember that just like with the second industrial revolution, which was not based upon steam engines in factories, that was the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution was steam engines for trains and for ships, and in particular trains. And it was putting steam engines on rails that could tow freight that caused the explosion of the network of trains all across Europe. And this is now having already taken place in China in the last 20 years and in India over the post-British period, that we're seeing this now underway in West Asia, to use the new geographical term. Right. Now, in this article, it revealed that the Israelis had become aware through their intelligence services, through the Mossad, right, of these schemes afoot. And so they had been talking for many months in this I2U2 forum of a scheme for a alternative cross to the INSTC, which is the Russia to India route. And that's basically north-south. And we're looking at all these west-east routes. And we even discussed 2 days ago about how there now appear to be 4 potential routes. Okay.
Yes.
So the scheme that the Israelis are now getting the Americans to push with both the Jordanians, the Saudis, the UAE, and the Indians. And this explains why their national security advisors were all meeting in Saudi Arabia this weekend, was for shipping to go from the west coast of India, and instead of going to the port of Chabahar and then across Iran and Iraq and Syria and then out into the Mediterranean, potentially via Lebanon, right? Instead, what they want to happen is ships go from India to the UAE, to Abu Dhabi or Dubai, right?
Yes.
Because the route isn't set in stone yet. Then to go from there to Riyadh, which is kind of like northern Saudi Arabia. Then from Riyadh to Amman, the capital of Jordan. And then from Amman into Israel. And it would go into either Tel Aviv or into Haifa. And then the idea was that shipping would go from there into Greece. Okay, right. So so this is a grand scheme, a long railway, and the reason why the Americans and the Israelis love it is it cuts out the Iranians and the Syrians. Now, this wouldn't be particularly popular with the Chinese, who, as we've discussed, have just committed to putting in $58 billion into Pakistan to connect China via Pakistan to the port of Gwadar and then across to the port of Chabahar, which is literally just across the Iranian Pakistan border in Baluchistan, and then on that rail route, or possibly to have stuff shipped directly to the Omanis and the Yemenis and the Qataris. Okay. But what happened this week is we had the G20 meeting in New Delhi of the foreign ministers of all the member nations of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And whilst at the multilateral level, it all appeared to be songs and dances and, share a pint of adrenochrome each, the bilateral meetings were actually very tense in some cases. So the Indians didn't get on at all well and issued a very undiplomatic post-meeting statement regarding Pakistan. And then they also had quite a lot of friction between the Indians and the Chinese, because they've got all these border disputes along the line of actual control that run through like the Himalayas and also right over towards Bangladesh and Nepal as well. And so what appears to be happening is the Indians, who have had quite a close relationship with the Israelis for many, many years, are aware that they're on either end of the cross, so to speak, of the INSTC, the east-west line.
Yes.
And they're like, well, we're suddenly going to be potentially dependent upon the Iranians and the Pakistanis, which makes them both feel very uncomfortable, right? And even if they don't physically own the land, it's very clear that the Chinese are going to be heavy partial financial owners of a lot of the infrastructure. So it's possible that the Chinese railway manager could say, tough luck, this month we're not taking any Indian cargo on the railways through Pakistan or Iran, or Syria for that matter. Okay? Which would stuff up the Indians.
Yes.
So they seem to be looking to do this fifth railway route. So to recap, we've got the Arctic Circle railway line that the Russians are starting to connect all of the new ports along the Northern Sea route. Okay? So they want to be able to transfer goods from port to port when the ice comes and the ships can't move. So they want an alternative for the ships.
Yes.
And they will also want that railway line to connect all the lumber and coal and nickel and titanium to the ports, exactly like the One Nation Party and Mr. Kelly in Australia talked about having the coal mines and the iron ore mines in the centre of Australia, basically connected to like Brisbane and to Perth by a railway that would run across the centre of Australia. Do you remember that proposal?
Oh, yes, very much. Yeah.
Right. So that's basically what the Russians are doing, a version of that all along their northern coastline.
Right.
Okay? So it's, for your Australian audience, it's an extremely similar logistical concept. But obviously, your Labour Party has rejected that, and the rent would be enormous to the One Voice people, should that vote go disastrously through, God forbid. But the Russians don't have any of those kind of issues. So they're just going ahead of that. Right. So that's the top railway line. Mm-hmm. The next one down is the traditional Trans-Siberian Railway that runs from St. Petersburg all the way across the Russian Federation to Vladivostok. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then the next one is what the Chinese have already got running, which is basically from China through Kazakhstan, some of the other Central Asian states, which is why the C5 agreements that we've discussed were so important, and then through potentially the South Caucasus, and then to the Black Sea. Okay? Yes. So that will skirt the north of the Caspian. Now, if you can go to it, could you please put up the photograph of the opposition presidential candidate for the Turkish elections, where he's holding the map?
Yep, I've got that. One
Can
second.
you put that one up on the screen so I can talk about that?
Yep, it's coming now. Here, this is it. Really
So
interesting. So
if you,
this is
I
the tweet.
I
I'm
don't
going to
know
zoom
if
in.
it's possible for you to zoom in possibly a little bit on the photograph. Excellent, that's perfect. Thank you ever so much, Jason. So there we have the leader of the Turkish opposition alliance, who's in the presidential and parliamentary elections that will occur next Sunday European time. Okay, now this is straight out of the blue, and he's literally in his house holding up a map showing a train line going all the way from China into Turkey. And this route going along the south side of the Caspian Sea as opposed to the north side, and then going into Turkey. And then obviously it would either be able to go to Istanbul or to Ankara. Okay, so that now is rail route number 3 that he is proposing. That
Yes.
effectively has become now the center line. Okay, what was the southern route is the route from China diagonally across Pakistan, then across Iran, then across Syria, then Iran, Iraq, and then Syria to their ports, but their ports are 50% controlled by the Russians. Okay?
Yep.
So the 5th route that we've now got is now the new southernmost route, and that's the one that's going to go from the UAE to Saudi Arabia to Jordan to Israel. So when I'm talking about all of these routes, people can see that this is just an absolutely incredible, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars on 2 existing rail routes and 3 new rail routes. It is absolutely huge, and it's like connecting all of these countries. And so the potential for the increase in trade is enormous. Now, what we've already seen is that the Indians are trying to de-dollarize, right? But
Yeah.
the Russians and the Chinese don't particularly want the Indian rupee. They're saying that they would prefer them to use the UAE dirham. Okay?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But in Pakistan, it's just been announced this weekend that they're now going to be importing, as Imran Khan has been demanding they do for months, discounted oil from Russia, which they've delayed doing because they were scared about being put under sanctions by the Americans. But supposedly the Americans are going to give them a pass on it. Starting in June, they're now going to be getting large quantities of oil from the Russians. That will go on the INSTC into Iran, and then will go from Iran into Pakistan. Now, they've said that they're going to pay for that in Chinese yuan.
Yes,
So
it's a
there's
big story.
another example of Pakistan, which particularly with the new government has been much more closely associated with the Americans than the Chinese, have basically done a huge series of deals with the Chinese, and they're now going to be using their own currency for their energy imports. Now, the picture that you showed there was of Imran Khan. Now, could you possibly please post the picture of the foreign ministers of China and Pakistan and Afghanistan? That picture of the 3 gentlemen
Yep.
standing together?
Here they go.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So the gentleman in the center is Bilawal Bhutto. The gentleman he's the foreign minister of Pakistan. Then the Chinese gentleman is the foreign minister of the People's Republic of China, and the gentleman on the right-hand side of the picture with the very large black beard is the acting foreign minister from the Taliban, from the nation of Afghanistan. Okay, so lots to talk about here. So the reason why the three of them were together is they were in the first trilateral meeting of China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Okay?
Gotcha.
Now, we know that the Chinese have got very close relationship now because they're talking about investing $400 billion over 25 years, even before the Saudi deal. Okay, so that's just like, to put it in context, the Russians are talking about putting $40 billion into Iran over 10 years. The Chinese are talking about putting in 400 billion, so 10 times the amount over 25 years. But they're very conscious that the Taliban has the potential for exporting terrorism into Iran and into Pakistan and potentially blowing up the railway lines in either of those two countries.
Yes.
So China not only wants to exert some influence and ensure regional peace and stability centered out of Afghanistan, but they also would love to be able to link Afghan exports of copper, tin, gold, and in particular, rare earth minerals to consolidate the Chinese global monopoly on the rare earth minerals. So China already has 80% of the world's supply of that. There's potentially another 5 to 10% from Afghanistan. And China wants to lock up not only the mining concessions, but also the transportation of that via Pakistan and Iran, because Afghanistan itself is landlocked. So it needs to go out on the most economical routes possible and then be exported either via the Pakistan port of Gwadar or the Iranian port of Chabahar. So there's a hell of a lot going on with the Afghans. Now, at the moment, most countries aren't recognizing officially the Taliban regime. And the Chinese have even criticized them in terms of trying to exclude women from the economy. Because in China, there's a very high female participation rate, just like in Australia and in Europe and in the United States. And they recognize that for the economy to really function, that the Taliban religious interpretations notwithstanding, that it's very important for a well-functioning society, particularly for unmarried women, in order to be able to participate in the economy. So in that regard, China's having a positive impact, and that's consistent with the United Nations Security Council requests to the acting government of Afghanistan. Now, they are putting so much money into Pakistan that the morning before that meeting with the Afghan foreign minister, they had a bilateral press conference that was just Mr. Qin Gang and Mr. Bilawal Bhutto. So it was just China and Pakistan. Now, what was absolutely incredible, and I'll try and link the video that exists, is the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who is the son of the previous lady leader Benazir Bhutto, and is also English and American educated. He speaks with a very, very English accent, much like mine. At this press conference, he gave what can only be described as a medieval fealty pledge. Like, for people who watch the coronation, the pledge of loyalty that William, Prince of Wales, publicly gave to his father, King Charles. Okay, so many people will have seen that. That's basically what Pakistan did to China. Okay, and they said that they were in total agreement with them on all of China's core issues, particularly in regard to the policy regarding Taiwan, like absolute obedience.
Yes.
And so what we can see is that with the $88 billion that they've put into Pakistan and are in the process of investing the second half of, right? Bearing in mind that Pakistan is on the verge of bankruptcy, China has basically bought Pakistan, lock, stock, and barrel. Okay? Now, Imran Khan, who was the previous prime minister last year,
Yes.
has put out a short video, and you showed his picture there.
Yeah.
And he is basically saying this isn't the first time that the current ruling party have attempted to sell out the nation of Pakistan. And he rather politely is asking the Chinese what exactly it is that they expect to get out of this scale of investment in Pakistan. Because $88 billion is a heck of a lot of money.
Indeed.
Okay? And they also are going to control the railroad running the entire length of the country and its newest, most modern port. So he's getting quite concerned in exactly the same way as you and I discussed a couple of days ago about how the Chinese are not only dealing with the existing alliance head by Mr. Shabazz, but also dealing directly with the constitutional head of state, President Alvi of Pakistan, who we discussed on Friday. So once again, that is the largest scale project of the Belt and Route Initiative. Now, the Chinese, not the Chinese, the Pakistanis, even before this meeting, have pledged to China that they are in total support of both the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative. So they basically are like, we are totally signed up to every aspect of Chinese foreign policy. Now, they were already partnered with them in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but so is India. And India hasn't signed up for any of those things.
Yes.
So that shows you the difference between the Pakistani relationship with the Chinese and the Indian relationship with the Chinese. And though the Indians think that they are forming a trade escape route or backup route via the UAE, cutting out the Chinese and the Iranians, right? When we look at the green energy transition, who is going to be providing a big chunk of the electricity in the UAE and probably into Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman? It's the same people that India's trying to cut out of the trade route deal. So how do you think that port in the UAE that the Indians want to connect their ships to a railway is going to work? if there's no electricity. And this is what we are doing in this show, is showing people how all of these interrelationships are actually working. And whilst the Israelis and the Americans think up that they've come up with a cunning scheme, and to that end, the Israeli foreign minister is going to fly to India to further discuss this with the Indians on Monday, European and West Asian time. It's very, very hard to see how they can really cut out the Chinese and the Iranians. Now, we've talked about maritime choke points, and one of the issues that is linked to AUKUS is Australia is saying that they want to protect both the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. Though Mr. Galloway was mocking that on another podcast just yesterday by saying that the very trade route that they're talking about protecting is to Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and China. And that's what Australia's half of their national exports are to.
Yeah.
Right? So that's somewhat incongruent.
Correct.
But the other maritime choke points are the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then the other one that's very important is the Dardanelles, that obviously all the Australians will remember, Anzac Day and Gallipoli. The whole idea of that was for the Royal Navy to force the sea passage through the Bosphorus Straits, right, into the Black Sea, and then at the same time for the British and the Anzacs to take the land on one side of the Dardanelles. That was what Gallipoli was all about. Okay, so that shows how that choke point is important, and that potentially, because the Turks control both sides, can either stop American ships from going into the Black Sea or from Russian ships coming out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So that is why who wins the Turkish presidential election is important. Okay.
This is a big story for those that who are tuning in, and many people are coming in and out of this show, and I encourage you to come back after it's completed and have another look, and you'll be able to put these details together. But Simon, this is an important point, isn't it? Because the Turkish elections are on this Sunday.
Yeah, so this Sunday, and then if nobody gets over 50%, then the second round, the follow-up election, will be on the 28th of May. Okay.
Yes.
So the final key maritime choke point that we're going to discuss is the Strait of Hormuz, which is the very narrow sea area in between the tip of Oman and the Iranian coastline. Okay. So that is why the Americans have an enormous naval presence in Qatar, okay, in order to guard that sea route.
Sure.
Because a huge percentage of the world's energy goes through that point, okay? And it's very vulnerable to the Iranians shutting it down. And for people who remember Gulf War One, and also the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s,
yes.
Okay, which was largely a proxy war with the Americans persuading Saddam Hussein to attack Iran after the Iranian Revolution on their behalf. Okay, so what then happened there was what was called the tanker wars. So people were able to shoot missiles, and they were also able to lay sea mines in the Persian Gulf. Now, today, and this has gone very largely underreported, right? There's been a big military delegation from the Iranians have flown into Muscat in the country of Oman
Yes.
to talk about security cooperation in the Gulf of Oman. Now, imagine, and I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen, but just imagine hypothetically if you had American missiles on the south side of the Gulf of Oman and you had Iranian anti-ship missiles on the north side of the Gulf of Oman. You could completely shut off all of the oil exports from the Persian Gulf, and the price of oil would go absolutely bananas. Now,
Sure.
I'm not necessarily saying that that's going to happen, but if instead all of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council plus Iran and Iraq form what was discussed in Moscow on the 9th of March and what the Chinese seem to be interested in participating in, right, is a, if not a NATO type alliance, then at least a non-aggression pact, such that the Americans are no longer needed to have their 50,000 troops in the Middle East / West Asia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we have extensive batteries of anti-ship missiles on either side of the Gulf of Oman, right, then what that doesn't necessarily do is stop oil tankers getting out of the Persian Gulf. What it would do is stop American warships getting in exactly the same way as the Turks can stop American ships getting into the Black Sea to fight the Russians. And this is the shift.
Wow. It's absolutely incredible when you look at it from that perspective. The Western Empire, as it stands, beating its chest and masquerading how powerful it is with vaccine mandates, etc., that all over Twitter today, it's rusting out again. It's largely irrelevant now, isn't it, to the rest of us here watching on a geopolitical scale. It just seems that the Western Empire is dying in real time.
Well, isn't it ironic that the Western Empire, via the World Economic Forum, is trying to force their green transition upon the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC? And what's their response? It's not to go to General Electric and to go to EDF and say, come and build us some French and American nuclear power plants. It's to go to the Chinese and the Iranians. So they try and jam this green agenda onto the Middle East, and they get the worst possible outcome, deals with the Iranians and the Chinese. It's just so ironic. But you can see now that the Israelis are squealing, and they are trying to get the Americans to intercede on their behalf so that they can be part of the Great Eurasian Partnership and benefit from the trade deals. Because otherwise, as we've seen now with the reintroduction today, and it actually took place today, right? They didn't just agree that Syria would re-enter the Arab League. What actually happened was Syria had been suspended in 2011, and that suspension was revoked. And so now they're automatically a full member of the Arab League again. And
Yes.
it would appear that President Assad is going to represent his nation and participate at the next head of government meeting, which is only 12 days away my time. That's on the 19th of May. And ironically, at exactly the same time as the whole of the Middle East are mending fences and all meeting together, all 22 nations in Riyadh, that same day, the G7 and South Korea are going to be meeting in Hiroshima in Japan.
Wow.
So we're going to have the Mideast as part of the Great Eurasian Partnership in one place, and on the other side of the world, all of the countries who are set against China meeting to talk about their Indo-Pacific alliance and
Yes.
the reason why the South Korean president is having lunch today with the Japanese prime minister is because they're on the verge of a formal alliance between South Korea and Japan, overcoming 100 years of animosity and outright Japanese colonial occupation of the whole of the Korean peninsula, in order to set themselves against the People's Republic of China and to be allied with the Americans in the defense of Taiwan. And once again, just as I've described with you with the Philippines and the whole NATO shift to the Indo-Pacific, as described by both Mr. Cleverly, who we mentioned at the beginning of this program, and also with Mr. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, the Russians and Chinese are exceptionally unhappy about NATO now being extended into the Indo-Pacific. And to that end, it has been announced that even though they're not a formal member, just as Australia and New Zealand are not formal members of NATO, but they have memorandums of understandings and they're kind of like associate members.
Yep.
A NATO liaison office has been announced for Japan this weekend. There's going to be NATO military liaison officers in Tokyo. So just as NATO has encroached upon the Russian Federation by expanding through all the Warsaw Pact countries, the Baltic nations, Finland, and with its invitation to Georgia and Ukraine to join in 2008, now we see them trying to militarily involve the Australians with the AUKUS project, the Japanese, the South Koreans by doing extended deterrence by stationing a nuclear submarine, which is soon to arrive in South Korea. And also with now their 9 military bases, the last 4 of which are all directly facing the Spratly Islands and Taiwan. And so you can see now why the Chinese gave that last chance to those Asian nations that they specifically flew to and invited them to join the Great Eurasian Partnership. But instead, they chose the Americans. And that is the hard line of the first island chain. That's the Philippines to Taiwan, to Okinawa, to Japan. And so we are really seeing the stark division of the South China Sea in exactly the same way as we've seen the red line drawn on the border between Ukraine and Russia, where the Russians weren't willing to have missiles that could be potentially nuclear tipped stationed so close to their border. And yet this is exactly what is now happening in both South Korea, the Philippines, and Japan. So people need to understand that this is the new Iron Curtain, essentially. Just like Winston Churchill described the falling of the Iron Curtain between Eastern Europe and Western Europe with the Russian sphere of influence, that he had objected to, but that the very, very sick President President Roosevelt had conceded to Stalin at the Yalta Conference that was done in Crimea. So there, the wheels of history turn back again. That conference was in Crimea, in the seaside resort of Yalta, on the south coast of Crimea, right, where Russian oligarchs still go to their seaside apartments, right?
Yes.
That is where Europe was split because the sick American president gave in to the Russians. So all of that has now been reversed, and NATO and the EU now dominate all that area that was handed over to the Russian influence in 1945. And instead now we have agreements that are going to be crystallized at the G7 meeting, instead to draw that line diagonally through the South China Sea. These are huge epoch events in the wheels of history. And that is what I'm trying to bring to your audience.
Well, you've done that in spades today, Simon. I know we've gone a little bit over time. I just want to make some comments here. Now, for those people that are watching, and there are many, many new viewers coming now from around the world, and thank you for your support, liking, following, subscribing, sharing, all the things that we all need you to do to build up support and viewership so that this show has real meaning, and Simon's work is truly incredible. Now, there are people that are asking, for example, where do I get a copy of this show? This is on Facebook, YouTube, it'll be on Twitter, and it'll be uploaded later to Rumble. You can download the YouTube feed. You just go and look up a free YouTube downloader, take the link, drop it in, and you'll be able to download and keep a hard copy of this show if you'd like to do that. So thank you for your support there. And for other people as well who are understanding, this is not the normal pace of news that's going on. This is at a rate of knots that we've never seen before. Isn't that true, Simon?
Even the Americans are saying that this is a twice in a century cycle of events now. And the Russians and Chinese are saying this is once in a century. So what we are seeing here is a reorganization of the Middle East stroke West Asia that dates back to the end of the First World War. So literally like 105 years. The formation of the Turkish Republic, okay, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, all of these kind of things that led eventually to the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the State of Israel, right? We've obviously got, say, an event like Pakistan and Indian independence from 1947. And now China is very much seeing this as a revenge for the colonial domination that occurred to them with the Boxer Rebellion. So that was, 1900, 1905, that kind of period. So when people are saying once in a century, that they are being literal. This is not some kind of like minor thing like, the G7 meets every year, or the G20 meets every year, or the United Nations meets every few months. This is nothing like that. This is an enormous geopolitical shift of allegiances, and unfortunately, at the instigation both of the Americans and Foreign Minister Borrell of the European Union, who's reiterated this call and got a lot of diplomatic pushback just today from the Chinese, they are calling upon the third world to ally themselves with NATO and support Ukraine. The third world wants nothing to do with Ukraine.
Yes.
Even though we've seen South Korea and Pakistan be pressured to sell ammunition via the Americans to the Ukrainians. a lot of these countries just want to stay well the heck away from it because they're aware that it has the potential to go nuclear, and they don't want their military bases or ports or train junctions to be on the far end of a Russian nuclear missile.
Yeah.
So the Chinese, on the other hand, are offering the business deal of a lifetime with the promise of non-intervention in the nation's traditional religious cultural affairs. And when we look at the election in Turkey,
yes, this Sunday,
there's and I know we're kind of like backtracing a little bit, but this is important for people who, when they're looking at the cultural changes that Australia is experiencing, to see the prospect of that in Turkey now. There are 5 million people who have turned 18 since the last Turkish presidential election. The opposition leader is pro-LGBTQ. The current president has twice, including at his rally that had somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 million people at it today, is saying that his Conservative Party, which is appealing to both the military secularists and the conservative religious establishment, is definitively anti-LGBTQ. And then you've got the opposition parliamentarian saying that he wants to be very pro-Western, and you've got Erdogan saying that he wants to be very pro-Eastern, including Russia and China. So this is a monumental choice for the people of Turkey. You've also got Erdogan saying that he's going to keep fighting in Syria and keep fighting the Kurds in Iraq, whereas the pro-European opposition leader, presidential candidate, is saying that he wants immediate peace, which of course would be of huge benefit to those 5 million people who otherwise face national service and army conscription and having to fight in Iraq and Syria. So it's a enormous generational choice between the young people, the religious conservatives, and the social conservatives, who generally have been the backers of Erdogan. And so when we're looking at something like that, this is why it's now being described even in the American media, which is extraordinary, that the Turkish election next Sunday, that we'll be able to talk about in just a week's time, is the most consequential election anywhere in the world in 2023.
Wow. The news, not only that, what else are we expecting this week? There's other news besides this that's coming up that we need to keep a close eye on that's coming up this week, Simon.
Well, we have the peace negotiations, which are due to be discussed at the foreign minister level in Moscow on the 10th, which is going to involve the Iranians, the Syrians, the Turks, and there's a possibility that the Chinese are going to turn up. Now, if the Chinese turn up and a deal is done, then that will just be an incredible diplomatic success for them. But from what Erdogan is saying, that looks unlikely before the election on the 14th.
Okay.
I thought that he might possibly do that deal and throw it out there to placate the youth vote. But it looks like he's doubled down on going with the army vote, which is very anti-Kurdish. And the last thing they want to do is see the Kurds be able to establish a power base in northern Syria with the support of the Americans.
Okay.
The Arab League deal that was negotiated on Monday in Amman, the capital of Jordan, has set conditions which have been accepted in Cairo today, and those include all the foreign forces leaving Syria. So that would include the Americans at their Al Tanf base, which is basically being used to steal billions of dollars of Syrian oil, and also the Turkish presence in the north, which is being used to fight the Kurds, who obviously want an independent Kurdistan that would stretch from Turkey to Syria through northern Iraq into Iran. But all four of the countries that have the Kurdish ethnic presence within their national boundaries don't want to give up part of their territory to form an enormous country called Kurdistan. And along with Kashmir, that's one of the largest ethnic populations in the world that at the moment don't have their own country. But that's an issue for another day. We could talk about that for days and days and days.
Indeed, it's been a brilliant summary of details that are emerging all around the world. This is the World Series News program, and that's certainly what you get when you tune in and hear from Simon all the way from Florida. These shows, we're becoming quite detailed, and as I said earlier, we're experimenting with different durations to make it more digestible for you, the audience. But I appreciate the time that all of you have taken to listen in and to grab the details, to respond and comment. And many of the comments that were on our Saturday show, there's 1,500 or so to get through, and we'll get through those and be able to address them. But if you have ideas, things that you want covered, or suggestions as well, drop them into the comments section, and we'll get to them in great detail. I want to thank my co-pilot, not only Simon, but Louis the Fly, that's been annoying me for the last 20 minutes, that keeps getting onto my face. In the middle of the cold snap here in Australia, there still is a fly that wants to think that it's still summer here. But I want to cut the broadcast at this point, but just to say thank you again to Simon, and thank you for all of your support. Simon, I'll look forward to speaking with you again, and if there is any urgent breaking updates, we will endeavour to both of us join our audience and bring them to you with all the details, so that you know that this is the place that you can count on for the detail that you simply cannot get, certainly not in the Western mainstream. And when you're on Twitter searching through all the details, isn't it great that you can come to a place like World Series News, and in an hour, give or take, you can get detail that you cannot get anywhere. Thank you everyone for watching. Simon, it's been a great thrill, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next show.
Jason.
Yes, go Simon.
May I just please add that we're not trying to boast, but just so people understand, this is like 48 hours of really solid work, boiled down to an hour or so. But whether or not people really appreciate all of the content, what we really depend upon them doing is, one, giving us feedback, particularly telling us other issues that they want more detail on, that I'm very happy to respond to.
Sure.
But also, when you share this information, which we beg you to do, please put a little comment on it. Or if you think there's just something that's relevant to a member of your friends or family, then tell them the timestamp of that comment, say at minute 40 or at minute 50 or at minute 60. So that if there's something that's particularly relevant to Australia, or particularly relevant to India, or particularly relevant to Israel, that you can highlight that, and then your friends and family can find that particular point without necessarily having to wade through 80 minutes. I am very, very conscious that this is very complicated. It's spanning the whole world, but we're trying to fill a niche where people get more detail in roughly 1 hour than anywhere else in the world. But for people who just find that certain portions of it are particularly of interest for them, then just identifying that and sharing it is still of enormous help to us as we try and get our viewership to increase.
Wonderful. Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself. And thank you, everyone. Thanks, Simon. And we'll see you all on the next show.